Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hi. Hello, world. Hello, everyone in NYU and esteemed students and guests. And I'm here today. My name is Rebecca Agby Davies. I'm so thrilled to be hosting my second discovery session panel coming out of NYU LA. A group of programs, a collection of programs started at NYU LA this summer by Nina Sadowsky, one of our guests today. It is an initiative at the university where Nina is trying to drive flexibility and innovation, which recently received that recognition at the university. So it's really exciting and I'm delighted to be here today. I am a former NYU alum from Tisch School of the Arts. And I'm so excited today to get to moderate with Nina Sadowsky and Lee McIntyre, our philosopher and novelist, although Lee is also a novelist. And just really excited to talk today about post-truth. I think it's going to be a really exciting session. And I'm just going to kick it off by introducing Nina and Lee, and then we'll get the conversation going. So Lee is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at BU, Boston University, and he's also an instructor of ethics at Harvard Extension School. He holds a Bachelor's of Arts from Wesleyan University and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He's taught philosophy at such prestigious universities as Colgate, Boston, Tufts, Simmons, and Harvard Extension School. He was formerly the executive director for the Institute of Quantitative Social Science at Harvard University. And he's also served as a policy advisor to the executive dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard and as the associate editor of the research department of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. His debut novel, The Sin Eater, is all about loyalty and was published last summer. So welcome, Lee.
Thank you. You seem like a slacker. You know, I feel like I'm outmatched. Okay.
Nina, just wait. This is good. So Nina is the head of our fantastic, I believe 2 years old now, NYU and LA program, Nina Sadowsky. She is an author, filmmaker, and educator, writer of one of my favorite movies, Made in Manhattan.
Actually, producer of The Wedding Planner, but
The Wedding Planner.
Yeah.
She has written numerous screenplays and produced The Wedding Planner. Her debut thriller, Just Fall, was published in 2016, and her Burial Society thriller novel series launched in 2018 with the second book series, The Empty Bed, published in January of 2020. The Burial Society series is in development for television, and Convince Me, which just came out this summer, is her fourth novel, and it's a fantastic read. And her fifth novel, Privacy, is scheduled for publication summer of 2021. So two esteemed, prolific writers who are here today to talk to us about post-truth, to talk to us about loyalty and lying and lies. Nina, I think you say it best when you, in the intro of Convince Me that, and you'll excuse my language, but we're going to talk about the fucking liars and their fucking lies. Is that correct today?
Well, the dedication of the book is this book is for everyone who's sick and tired of the fucking liars and their fucking lies. Again, part of my language, but my publisher let me get away with it in print. So, but you know, the book really came from a place of utter rage at what I thought a post-truth culture was doing to our society, how I felt like abandoning science and facts and claiming that there were alternative facts. I just feel that it's probably the single most divisive thing that's happening in our culture right now. And I, you know, with all of my work, I try to explore a social issue of some kind. I've tackled things like mental illness or human trafficking or domestic abuse. But this book was completely different because it was a total rage rate. And which means I wrote it in like a pure fury because it wasn't, a lot of people assume the book is political, but it's not. I wrote a personal story, you know, no spoiler alert. The book starts at the funeral of a man, and it's the people who loved him discovering that he was a sociopath and a liar who left them all in a heap of trouble, right? So that's, you know, that's the trajectory of the book. But a lot of people, you know, obviously the death of the author, the reader pulls out whatever they want. So some people have seen it as a completely political novel. A lot of women have commented, oh, I've been snowed by a guy like that, and seen that just the personal story, right? But I like that it operates on both levels. And it's a funny thing because in his work as a philosopher, I know that Lee really approaches his writing the same way I do, which is how can I tell a story to move a mind or change an opinion? Would you say that's right, Lee?
Yeah. So my book that's, you know, dealing with the liars and their lies is called Post-Truth, and I was invited to write this book by my editor at MIT Press. It was just after the 2016 election, and Post-Truth was named the word of the year by the Oxford dictionaries, you know, for all the reasons that we would imagine. And the advantage of writing a book with the title Post-Truth and, you know, getting it out there relatively soon is that I got to think really hard, not just about how the term had been used by journalists and by others, but to reflect a little bit on what it meant. Not just the definition of the word, but what some of the implications were going to be. And my big fear in writing the book was, well, it wasn't going to be relevant by the time the book was published. But, you know, of course, things just continued to get worse and worse. So, Nina, when you talk about the inspiration, the motivation for your book, I had somewhat the same inspiration, except my book is nonfiction. And the irony there is that one of my very favorite authors is George Orwell. And I always wanted to write, I always loved dystopian fiction. I wanted to write a book like 1984. Post-Truth is like that, except it's nonfiction. I mean, that's the hard part. I define post-truth as the political subordination of reality. And that's what's happening as a country. In your book, you talk about the subordination of reality in relationships, one-on-one, in a fictional setting, but in a personal way, and, you know, what it means for us as individual human beings. And I talk more about the societal roots and implications of it for us, the United States as a democracy, and for the world. But we're really coming at the same problem, just in slightly different ways, I think.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, one of the questions that I hope people, I mean, I always hope that people first and foremost just enjoy my books, but that also that it sparks some conversation afterwards. And one of the things that I really hoped people would ask themselves after reading Convince Me was whether they received information differently if it was coming from someone that they found attractive or charismatic or had a relationship to. And I think that we all do. I think it's just human nature. You know, you hear something from a friend or a beloved figure and you take it as truth without vetting. And I think that that is really the problem. There's so many different truths out there, right? So many different ways to spin things. And you know, the other thing that I would say that I think is really true, you know, about writing fiction is that, you know, can be an emotional truth there. So in some ways, fiction can be the greatest reality, right? The feeling of betrayal, of having realized that someone has lied to you and that has caused you harm, right? That is a truth, whether it's the president of the United States or it's your boyfriend, right? That is an emotional truth. And so what I believe the value of fiction is that we relate cathartically to the protagonist and to the characters. And as they go through things, we go through them and then, you know, hopefully come out the other side feeling like we've reclaimed something of ourselves, particularly in this, the way we abdicate ourselves if we just accept statements as truth without vetting them.
Do you think, oh, go ahead, Lee.
Go ahead, please.
I was going to say, do you think, for both of you who have such prominent roles at universities, do you think that that is an important contributing factor to how we are receiving information, or how you guys are educating or nurturing minds in terms of responsibility and that emotional empathy and that journey?
I'm going to say it depends. And the reason is because a lot of people in my world that I deal with every day are people who change their beliefs based on information, and they bother to vet it, to figure out what's true and what's false. And it's considered to be a bad thing to make up your mind based on how you feel or what you want to be true. I'm talking here about scientists. I'm particularly interested in the problem of science denial. So as a philosopher of science, I study scientists and what makes scientists distinctive. But the interesting thing is to realize that not everyone forms their beliefs that way, even about empirical subjects, even about climate change, even about vaccines or COVID. A lot of people, and Nina, you pick up on something you were just saying, a lot of people make up their mind based on how they feel about whether they want something to be true, especially if they hear that message from someone that they trust. And that's why it's so darn hard to convince somebody with facts, because the facts are not what convince them. It's the identity of the person who's giving them the facts. So Rebecca, to answer your question, if we're in different information silos, if we're getting our facts from different places, then we're going to end up with different beliefs. And the challenge is, how do we talk to one another? How do we bridge that gap so that I can talk to a climate change denier and try to change his or her mind? How am I going to do it? That's the real challenge, I think, for people in philosophy of science these days. But it's a larger societal challenge too. How do you convince somebody? Your book is called Convince Me. How do you convince somebody who doesn't agree with you? What's the process?
Well, I would argue, both as a novelist and as a filmmaker, that a big part of that is the power of narrative stories. I really, and if you look at, sort of even the rules now for political activism, a lot of it is rooted in tell a story that people can relate to. And I think, so I feel that, a lot of great work is done through the media. I mean, I know the media is decried all the time, but I think I think that one of there are two things that really increase people's empathy. One is travel, and the other is reading fiction, because you are forced to travel to a different place. You are pushed into other perspectives, right? In both those circumstances, you are forced out of your comfort zone, your perspective, and forced to look at the world through another person's perspective. And, if you think about, how, for example, Will and Grace is largely credited by people who work in social media activism and social content activism as being directly responsible for gay marriage in this country, because, it normalized it across the idea of the gay community became normalized. If you think about that, if you think about what, Transparent did for the trans community, all of that sort of ability to take stories that have been marginalized or squelched, frankly, and explore them through media really does change minds. It really does have the power to change minds and hearts. And so that's where I feel like, well, Lee is figuring out how to talk to a science denier. I'm trying to think about what I could write that might make a science denier to feel an emotional connection to a story that might get them to change their mind.
but you know what? You put your finger on it there. My next book is called How to Talk to a Science Denier. I mean, literally, that's the title. And the way that you convince someone is face-to-face conversation. That builds trust. That kind of engagement convinces people. But you're absolutely right, too, that what really convinces people sometimes is a story. They don't want an argument.
Right.
They want to empathize with that character, even if it's a fictional character. By the way, Rebecca, this is why I wrote a novel, because I'd written all these nonfiction pieces, and then I had a truth that I wanted to tell that I couldn't tell in nonfiction. And so sometimes, the irony is that you have to lie. You have to write a piece of fiction in order to tell the truth about something. So I tried to see what that was like. But going back to what Nina said before, my nonfiction got better once I became a novelist, because I learned how to weave stories into my nonfiction, and because that's what really ends up convincing people.
I think I don't want to segue too far away from that because I do want us to stay on topic, and this is so interesting, but I do want to hear, because I feel like that's a perfect entree or segue into how you guys met, right? Like your impetus of like, so Nina, will you tell us how you met Lee?
There's a fantastic convention every year in New York for thriller writers called Thriller Fest. It's run by the International Thriller Writers, which I'm a member and Lee's a member. And, you know, let me describe it this way. It's about 1,000 people who either write thrillers or love thrillers in a hotel in Manhattan with alcohol for a week. I mean, it's a ball. But it is enormous fun. And one of the really lovely things about it is that there's a very open atmosphere. And, you know, one thing that's true in the literary community is authors support other authors. If screenwriters supported other screenwriters the way that authors support authors, it would be a kinder, better world. But in any event, so I was a debut there in 2016 with my first novel, Just Fall. And as a debut author, we got to have a breakfast and sit up on a table and say a few words about our book. And I talked about that book, which is on the surface of it about a woman who discovers on her wedding night that her husband is a contract killer, and she's told she has to go kill someone in order to save his life. So that's the thriller aspect. But my heroine happens to break up a human trafficking ring along the way. And also the book asks, I think, a kind of a universal truth, which is what moral lines will you cross in the name of love? And that to me was sort of a big concept that was interesting. Where will we compromise ourselves? Where will we stretch ourselves, look the other way, you know, in pursuit of this romantic ideal? And so I talked about that briefly, and afterwards Lee came to the signing table because what I said about trying to ask a social question or a human question through narrative really resonated with what he was doing. At that point, he had not published The Sin Eater, right? Because you were a debut this year, right?
This year, yeah, and I missed it. But I missed my debut breakfast because of the pandemic. But yeah, no, my debut is this year.
Right. But we just started talking, and then I read Post-Truth when it came out, and I, you know, kind of blew my mind, and then you know, we just have remained friends ever since. But it did begin in the steamy halls of the Grand Hyatt with.
I love that. And then Lee, can you tell us a little bit about, so Sin Eater, your debut novel, is about loyalty, correct?
It is. In addition to thinking all day about science deniers, I also teach ethics. And so I teach ethics over at Harvard Extension School. And I'm constantly making up examples. Philosophers always do this, make up an example of, you know, what about this, what about that, what would you do in this situation? But I'm thinking about morality a lot. And what Nina mentioned before about what moral lines would you cross, it's always, you would cross a moral line for people that you love. That's when you would do it. And so I love thrillers that have to do with an ordinary person in extraordinary circumstances. And so the story that I wanted to tell there was what would happen if you got a knock on the door late one night and it was Child Protective Services saying that they were going to take your daughter based on a false complaint from your new nanny. And this was the premise for my novel because this actually happened to someone that I knew. And I thought, okay, well, let's tweak this a little bit. But let's also think, who would I call? You can't call the cops, you know, who would you call for help? Well, as it just so happens, the person that I would call is my best friend from childhood, who is an outlaw biker. I grew up in a very rough neighborhood, and there was a biker club across the street, strip clubs, tattoo parlors. I mean, it was a bad area, and my friend was from the same area. And I went to college and grad school, and he went into the service and became a biker afterward. And we've remained friends all these years. And he's the person that I would call. So if I were in that situation and I needed to solve a conspiracy and get my daughter back, I'd call my friend. So in the book, I had the protagonist hide out in a biker club and have to learn, you know, how to get tougher in order to try to solve this conspiracy. And it was a lot of fun to write. I mean, writing fiction is much harder than writing nonfiction. And it takes years and years and years to get the craft seriously. That's also why Thriller Fest exists, to have classes on that. And so it took me a long time, but it was a labor of love. And it ended up being published, and I'm really happy about that.
I know for a fact that thrillers are hard to write because I just took a wonderful thriller writing class with Nina this summer to try to do my own, and Nina has a gift, and so do you, Lee, but it's very difficult.
I want to circle back to something you asked about before, Rebecca, about sort of what you felt, what pressure we felt or responsibility we felt as educators, because I think that's really important. And I was actually on there was a NYU Women's Leadership Council event this morning, and I got to attend one of the breakout sessions, and which we were talking, it was led by a woman who was talking about, the rise of the right and historically, the place of the right in American politics. And, one of the things that came up in that discussion, which I think is really relevant, is that along with the rise of the political right, there is also this anti-intellectualism, this sense that, that people who are educated are somehow, elitist. And, I think quite the opposite. I think that, if you learn to become a critical thinker, which is the real value of education, then you can figure out what's truth and what isn't truth and make your own decisions and read an article with 5 different perspectives about any issue, and draw your own conclusions, right? And that's where I really do feel, really impassioned as an educator, because I see sometimes, I saw last year with some students who had this frustration with the media, and they felt like it was the media's job to figure out the truth and tell it to them, because they were so frustrated by not knowing how to look and what was truth and what wasn't. And, we got into a pretty hefty debate about that, because I do think that, there's a real importance in critical thinking. And that is what comes out of education and the educational community. Finding a safe place to have your ideas be challenged, to challenge other ideas, that is so necessary. And because at our program and in my history as a teacher, I've primarily dealt with storytellers, with filmmakers, that's the thing that I've really tried to impart, 2 things. One, you have to have an authentic story. You want something that's really going to move people on a universal level. I always say, if you don't want to tell a universal story, go write poetry, right? But, you also have you have to have the personal part of it too, that authentic part where you're really caring about what you're saying, right? Because, even in the lightest comedy, there is room for a theme. And in fact, things that don't have anything that's a thematic underpinning, we don't resonate with us as audiences. So I think ethics are super important. It was one of the things that I said when I interviewed for my job at NYU, is that I felt we really need to both model and teach ethics to students. It's a real priority for me. And also to really encourage this sense of agency, critical thinking, and challenging, the status quo, because depending on where you're looking, the status quo can come from a lot of different directions.
That is so true. And I know, Lee, I think you put it really beautifully the other day, echoing what Nina is saying. I think you're the one who said democracy functions with educated citizenry.
Yeah, it's really, and also active citizenry, right? We can't be passive about it. People, so Nina knows, because she's, and because you've read Post-Truth, that I have a half of a chapter in there where I talk about the history of media and the idea of objectivity and how we got to the place where we are. And everybody seems to think that they're entitled to objectivity, that it's, they want it spoon-fed to them. What they don't realize is that it's a relatively recent invention in media for a paper not to be completely partisan, or at least to have a point of view. And it really only started in the mid-19th century with the invention of the telegraph, where the AP was, putting out its wires, and it couldn't slant it because it wanted to tell the straight facts so that the different newspapers could spin it any way that they wanted. But that was where the idea of objectivity came from. And then the New York Times was the first that really picked it up as, that was going to be their thing. But, until then, I think that people were very skeptical news consumers. You didn't automatically believe something just because it was, in newsprint or somebody had, told you, because you always assumed that they had a point of view. Now, I think that we have gotten spoiled by an expectation of media in the last couple of decades, so that when it's under attack in the Trump era, people don't know what to do. But the answer is the one that Nina gave. Be skeptical, be critical, engage those skills. Don't look for the other things that the author has written. Is it published by a publication that you recognize? Is there a date on the story? That's one that often happens with fake news. There's no date on the story. So there are all of these things that we can do to try to triangulate and figure out what's actually true. Just even to consume media from multiple sources. A lot of people don't do that. Mm-hmm. And it results in silos of information where you're never really challenged by any point of view that you don't already agree with. And that is the death of critical thinking. And it's the beginning of authoritarianism. Because if you get cynical and think, well, there's just no way to know the truth, then it's real trouble.
Yeah. I love that. Media literacy has been something that has been really important to me. I have a background in children's television and trying to think through the ethics of, like, if you're doing a show for a preschooler or you're doing a show for someone who's 8 years old, like, what is your responsibility in terms of the information or the pro-social cues that you're giving them, and what does that look like? And that includes everything, including like ethnicity and gender, and like what are we modeling in terms of communicating ethics through storytelling. Can you talk to me a little bit, both of you, about your creative process? Nina, I know you mentioned like always having a moral center or a moral, a moral or universal truth that you want to bring to your stories. Can you tell us a little bit about how you take, or when you're rage writing, like when these ideas come, like what is a little bit of your creative process, and how has thriller writing in particular helped be a conduit for story, for getting those ethical questions across?
Love that question. I chose thrillers partly because they were sort of my go-to, guilty pleasure read, right? But also because I thought, I wanted to write about big emotions, right? Big feelings that I was having. And, as I say, I'm a rage writer, so I get infuriated about something and then I hit the computer. And so I always think, my process is always this. I figure out my themes first. Usually I'm enraged. I'm enraged by domestic violence or the lack of attention to mental illness or what lying is doing to destroy our country. And then I go, okay, now this is what I'm enraged about. What characters could I best explore these ideas through? What characters could I create where I could create dilemmas and situations, and I really reverse engineer it. I think about, so for example, with Convince Me, I knew I wanted to kill my liar off at the beginning of the book, partly because I knew it would be really cathartic. So I did, he was dead, right? I created him and I killed him, and that felt great because I was so mad. But I also did it on a more creative level, besides the catharsis. I did not want him to be able to use his tricks of deflection and diffusion and all of that once his lies started to come out. I wanted everything to be laid bare by the people investigating the truth in a way that he could not defend himself. And that was important to me. I will say, in respect to process, that book was very different. Normally, I always start with theme, figure out characters, do character bios. I'm pretty methodical. I do a lot of pre-writing and a lot of thinking about what I want to talk about, outlining all of that. That was completely not the case with Convince Me. I wrote it in just a frenzy. I would wake up at 3 a.m. and go write for 2 hours. I would have a half an hour between meetings, and I would jump in. I couldn't stop writing it. It poured out of me like a fountain. So I think it was very different, and I think it was so different because I was just so damn mad. So that's my process. But I do a lot of pre-writing and I do a lot of thinking. And if I've done all the pre-writing and the thinking, then the writing for me is actually very fast. It's all that pre-writing that helps me get ahead of where I'm going.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And Lee, what's your process? I know you're at work on, or you're bringing your first one. I know that Sin Eater is not your first novel, correct? So, but the first one you're still working on.
Yeah, the first one I'm still working on, but the fiction came to me very late. So my process has changed a lot over time because I'm trained as a scholar. I have a PhD in philosophy, and the way you move up the academic ranks is to write articles on technical topics that end up being read by about 25 people that you're already on a first name basis with. And I've done those. I've done articles that will make you cry because they're so technical that you can't really read them. And at a certain point, I decided that I didn't want to keep doing that kind of philosophy. Not that I wasn't interested in the same set of issues, but because I wanted to take this passion that I had for what was so important about science and engage with the larger public. And so I did something that was very unsexy at the time. It's now become sexy. I became a public philosopher. I started to write exclusively for general, I shouldn't say exclusively, but primarily for the general public. And so I stopped writing articles and I started writing books. And once I put that first rock in the pond, the ripples just carried me through the rest of the way. The first book was called Dark Ages, which was about how I think that we're in a second dark age now. We're in the dark ages of social science. We're roughly, politics has done to social science what religion did to natural science in Galileo's time. So that was my argument for the first book. That then led to my next book because I was thinking, well, okay, is it just natural social science? I'll just make the social sciences better. But then all of a sudden, everybody was attacking natural science. And I thought, well, I got to write a book about that. So that book was Respecting Truth. It was about, well, it's really important to respect truth. And here are all the people who are attacking science, and here's why they're wrong. And so I was grabbing onto some things from popular culture, attacks on climate change, attacks on evolution.
Why do you think there is so much, so much attack on truth right now? I get that. I know what why do you think at this particular moment, what do you think crystallized to make it where we are now?
The story of that is the story of what happened next after Respecting Truth, which is that all of that science denial was so successful that it convinced politicians and others that they could use those tactics about anything they wanted to. How many people were at an inauguration, whether it rained on the speech at that inauguration, whether the crime was going up or down, whether the coronavirus will disappear. You know who I'm talking about here, right? But people think of science denial as being ridiculous, and it sort of is, but it was successful. 60 or 70 years of denying the truth about climate change and vaccines and evolution, all these other things, was a monstrously successful campaign, and it convinced political operatives that they could use those exact same tactics about the truth about anything. Add in the internet so that now the liars have a way to amplify their misinformation. And here we are. The QAnon conspiracy has now gone mainstream. Something that is so fringe, so odd, that it never would have been even talked about in polite circles in journalism 10 years ago, is now, I just saw it on MSNBC. Somebody had a segment on it. What that does is it just gives oxygen to it. And so with that old Will Rogers, lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on. That's what the internet does. So today, there have always been liars. There have always been deniers. There have always been people who spin and all that. What's different today is that they have a megaphone and they have a way to get the lie to a receptive audience who may not be listening to anybody else. And we're now in real trouble because, like I said, this is where the ripples in the pond got bigger. I wrote Post-Truth. I wrote a book called The Scientific Attitude. My next one is How to Talk to a Science Denier. This problem has just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. So, I mean, my career has been a failure because I've been trying to tamp down this problem the whole time. I'm now on my 5th book and it just keeps getting worse and worse. So I don't know. I should switch
down to the commodification of news, right? I mean, that's what it really comes down to. And we touched on this a little bit the other day, is that, you know, once there was this sort of glorious period where television news was considered a public service, and there was no sense that it should be something that was monetized by the networks. And then it really changed with 60 Minutes, with this magazine format news, where all of a sudden networks went, oh, hey, we can make money off of the news. And then you fast forward, you know, to the launch of CNN and onward and onward. And now we're in this, you know, I mean, where I feel like a lot of what is called news today is not news at all. It's punditry. It's not reporting. It's not facts. It's people offering opinion about various topics, but it's not actual reporting. And I think that is, you know, part of the problem too, because you know, I don't care what this random guy's opinion is. I want to know what happened, and I will make up my own decision about what I feel about that.
So science denial is one route, cognitive bias is another. But you put your finger on it, the denial of the decline of traditional media and the rise of social media was really a devastating blow that brought on the post-truth era, because, you know, as you point out, what used to be a sort of a lost leader for the networks, you know, half an hour in the evening to justify that they were broadcasting in the public good so they could have all their entertainment, make the money. Once they figured out how to monetize news, they didn't want it really to be news anymore, because if you're trying to make money, investigative journalism is very expensive. You know, you have to have bureaus all over the world and people doing these stories that may not pay off for a long time. But you put a microphone in front of a pundit, that's very cheap. And so that's what it's become. I think it actually started just slightly before 60 Minutes. Well, actually, I don't know. Maybe 60 Minutes was around before that. But I'm thinking of Ted Koppel, the Nightline, during the Iran hostage crisis, when every night he came on, and people were glued to it. And I think that's sort of the people who came up with the idea for CNN and Fox. They started to think, wait a minute, you mean we can compete with the entertainment shows? And it's to our detriment. Yeah. So where do people go now for their news? They go to Facebook.
Yeah, I mean, Pew Research says from their study last year, 60% of adults in the US are getting their news from social media and from no other source, or not seeking out other sources other than like the timeline and the algorithm. I do want to get back to something that both of you had just touched on, though, and this idea of or about intent, right? So we know that opinion is cheap and investigative journalism is expensive, but what about the intent? Is it, if the point of post-truth and that phrase and that word in particular is about deliberately misleading people for political gain or political opportunity or for influence, what is the role of intent in the context of these post-truth conversations? Nina.
Well, I mean, I think that, what I basically argue for is just, there is intent, right? We've seen it all the time. There's malicious intent. The Cambridge Analytica scandal, right? And that just came out about, this deliberate suppression of Black voters, right? And using social media to do that. This I think is, I think that we're really at a critical point in our country. And I don't mean just because of the election, which is also critical, but I mean because I think that, and this is something that I really urge my students and I urge my readers and, basically anyone I come into contact with is, there is malintent out there. It's not, there's idiocy and stupidity, but there is also malintent and an attempt to control you. And I think a lot of that, is dark money and corporate influence. And I don't know anyone saw Sheldon Whitehouse's, presentation, but, I think that these things are all real, we are really, I think more than anything, controlled by the very wealthy few. And I think that it is in their interest for them to hold on to what they have to keep us befuddled, if not misinformed, right? And I think that what Lee said before about people getting to the point where they're just so frustrated because they don't know, and therefore, and it's too much work, and therefore they give up on everything. And they just say, well, I'm not gonna, I'm just gonna blow it all off. That's really the concern. That's, I think, the assault of competing information, misinformation. Even if you flip between Fox and MSNBC, you're looking at two completely different worlds. And unless you're willing to say, okay, which part of this world do I believe? Can I dissect this? What can I check? It is easier. I get it. We're all exhausted. It is easier to fall into a belief system and just, put up your guard and stay there. But I do think that, there's, and I think that there's, so I think there is deliberate malintent and intent. And I think there's also, just, as I said, as Lee was saying, the social media makes it so easy to just perpetuate and perpetuate and perpetuate.
You're absolutely right. As far as science denial is concerned, disinformation is created. And it's created for a purpose because it's to someone's benefit. Often, there's a lot of corporate money behind science denial. One of the most effective science denial campaigns ever was engineered by the tobacco companies in the 1950s, when there was going to be this study to show that there was a link between cigarette smoking and cancer. The head of all the tobacco companies hired a public relations expert who said, you've got to fight the science, hire your own experts, put white coats on them, take out ads in newspapers, and they did. And it worked like a charm, and they rode that for decades and decades, knowing that cigarette smoking caused cancer. But they were able to create enough doubt and confusion in the public mind that they profited in the meantime. That created the blueprint that was then used for climate change, which of course by then was oil money. And so people don't, there is an enormous audience that are duped or maybe partisan, or for whatever reason, they're going to believe that message. But there are a small cadre of people who create that message, as you say, with malintent. That story that I just told, by the way, is well told in Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's book, Merchants of Doubt, if anybody's interested in how the roots of all that go back to the cigarette campaign from the big tobacco companies. That story is well told in that book.
So if all the liars are telling lies and literally making up stories, I think that's a perfect segue back into what you are both doing, right? In terms of creating stories to influence, and that's what we talked about at the beginning, at the kickoff of this session, is how you're both using story to influence and sway. And Lee, I know you've mentioned it repeatedly, and is how to talk to a climate change denier, right? That like, what are these stories? What are the things that you both think in your own writing or in the writings of others? What are the things or key points that you think it can influence people? Is it emotion? Is it character? Like, can we talk a little bit more about like what drives influence when we are perhaps cognitively weak beings?
I would say empathy would be my answer. I think when we connect empathetically to people, and by that I mean, if you can find one thing that you connect on, which is why I tell my larger social stories and personal tales, right? Because, I think women are mostly the readers of psychological fiction, right? So I don't think that there is a woman alive who hasn't been in some relationship where she's washed up and went, oh my God, was I taken by that guy? There was, and I think that's why it resonates, because everyone's been lied to by some dude and had to go lick their wounds and, figure out how to feel better after that. As I said before, I think that but I also tell the story from the perspective of the liar's best friend, and his business partner. So there's a business betrayal there, and from the perspective of his mother. And I chose the three different perspectives because I wanted different readers to attach to different views and to feel, and also all my narrators are unreliable in this book. So in essence, in the very technique of the storytelling, I'm commenting in a very meta way on the thing that I'm talking about, right? And so all of that was, you know, very conscious. With the book I'm working on now, I'm really dealing with 3 themes. One is the collective weight of grief that we're all carrying right now, and both individually and as a society. And I'm asking the question, how much can we carry before we break? I'm also looking at the loss of privacy, which comes from everything from us zooming into each other's homes to how we share on social media. I mean, it's true. I mean, you know, like, right? I'm, of course, a thriller writer, so I see an empty window and I think a murder has happened just off screen, but that's a digression. So I'm dealing with that loss of privacy and how that has affected us. And in a tertiary way, I'm also dealing with the pervasive sense of violence or incipient violence that surrounds women and people of color in this country, right? So those are 3 pretty heavy, weighty themes, right? But what the story I'm writing is, you know, on a surface level is about a therapist and a journalist who have an affair, right? Like, you know, and things go wrong, right? So again, I always think about what are the things I want to talk about? What do I hope to spark people to think about, right? And I do create book club kits, which ask these questions. Are all on my website for my books. And I hope that people will, you know, and I've been to some book clubs where people take out the questions and we have the discussion, and, you know, and by the way, any book clubs, I'm happy to show it virtually and do that. It's fascinating to me because I love to hear what people have taken out of my work. Sometimes people have interpret things I never intended, right? Which is also, you know, kind of glorious. But I think that, you know, I think that because I can't not write because it's how I process the world. And it's how I stay, frankly, as sane as I am, which may be debatable, that level of sanity. But it's how I keep myself together. It's how I process. And at the same time, I really do feel as my audience has grown, that people are kind of getting what I'm doing, that people are understanding that, you know, through the power of fiction and through the power of narrative, you really can sway hearts and minds, which is what I'm trying to do.
I love that. And Lee, what are the tools that you think that you're bringing, or what do you depend on as your I won't say tricks, as the vehicles for persuasion, both and not only in your writing and your fiction writing, but also in the classroom as you're teaching ethics?
Yeah, it's a great question, because as I was listening to Nina talk there, I realized that I'm fortunate that I've got both nonfiction and fiction, because I've got an outlet for my rage, convincing, arguing, which is my nonfiction. So my fiction for me is pure enjoyment, pure, you know, what if, you know, where would this go? So it's not that there's no theme or no idea behind it. You're reminding me again, Nina, why I love your fiction so much, because you write about ideas. And I think that that's really important. There has to be something at stake in a novel for me to care about it, to care about the characters. And your novels have an idea at stake. And I love that kind of writing. It's why I came up to you 4 years ago to your booth to talk to you, because that's the kind of book that you write and what I want to write. So my next novel, which Rebecca, you point out, is actually my first novel that got jumped over, but I published my second one as my debut. The first novel, which is called The Art of Good and Evil, is about the following question: is there such a thing as a moral crime? What would that be? And I tell that story through the life of a philosophy professor teaching ethics at Harvard. Didn't go too far away from the truth there. Mm-hmm. But this protagonist has a horrible tragedy befall him in the first chapter of the book. And he reevaluates his life and has to decide what makes life worth living. And as it turns out, what makes life worth living is making the world a better place through getting rid of people who make it a worse place. So you've got a philosophy professor who becomes a vigilante killer.
Very Dexter of you.
I was just going to say, like a Dexter reboot.
My pitch for the book, Nina, my pitch for the book: what if Dexter taught ethics at Harvard? That was my pitch for the book. And so, of course, because it's a thriller, everything goes wrong. You know, he has certain success, not success, you know, a lot of twists and turns. But it's all centered around the price that we pay for trying to, you know, live our life according to reason. You know, this character is just, he's doing this because it's not just because of the passion he feels about what he's lost in life, but because John Stuart Mill said that that was the reasonable thing, utilitarianism. You do the greatest good for the greatest number. So if you have to kill certain people to make other people happy, John Stuart Mill would approve. But what if you really tried to live your life like that? It would be a disaster. And that's what the book is about. It's about what would actually happen in life if you took the philosophers so seriously that you lived your life according to their dictates. And each of the characters, and I shouldn't say this out loud because this is a secret, so don't tell anybody. Each of the characters in the book are coming at it from a different moral point of view. I've got a Kantian, I've got an egoist, an altruist, a utilitarian. And I don't tell people that because they immediately go to sleep, and it's supposed to be a fun book, and it is a fun book. But underneath the surface, for philosophers, that's what I did. So that it's actually a book that you can learn ethics from, because it's about how you think about this question, can there be a moral crime, from these different points of view.
I love that. I love a covert philosophy thriller.
Yeah.
No, I know we're like the Trojan horses of ideas over here. We're like sucking them into pulp.
Yep.
I love it. I love it. I do want to open it up just as we're wrapping up. I do want to open it up. If there are any questions for either Lee or for Nina that you guys want to throw into the chat or the Q&A, please feel free. But I do want to open it up to Lee and Nina. Is there anything that I haven't touched on or that you guys haven't brought out in each other that you want to cover before we wrap up the session here today? Because I have plenty, and I also have plenty of more other questions. So,
well, ask another question.
I mean, I do want to talk a little bit about. I mean, I'm so caught up on this idea of intent, and I love when Lee in Post-Truth talks about like hubris and just the idea of our own selfishness of thinking we know what is right, and to me that kind of. I did grow up in a household where I was told that news is a business and that I should question who is giving me my information. Yeah. And I am continuously alarmed by the fact that most of the people I know don't do that. I know the wrong people. I know.
Because I'm like you know, my father was a politician when I was growing up. So we had 5 newspapers delivered to the house every day, you know, because he felt he needed to be informed. And so, you know, when you're getting, you know, the New York Times, the Long Island Daily Press, the Post, the Daily News, you know, I forget what the 5th one was, but, you know, you would see all these different perspectives and you would see how, you know, a headline could be so differently treated from one paper to the next. I mean, I know both the New York Post and the Daily News are sort of considered, you know, pulpy, you know, trash newspapers, but the Post has a very, very right-leaning bent and just recently placed some fake news about Hunter Biden and Burisma, which was disproven. Whereas the Daily News has an incredibly liberal bent and has been, you know, roasting Trump on its covers throughout his presidency. But, you know, which is a polarization that I have not seen in those 2 newspapers, you know, did not see when I was growing up in New York. But I think it's because I don't think we can change from where we are, right? Where we are. Social media isn't going away. Partisanship isn't going away. I really think what it just makes it incumbent on all of us to really think about how do we encourage critical thinking.
And how do we encourage critical thinking, right, too, in an age of artificial intelligence, right, where the machine, I don't want to get to, I mean, my day job is at a movie studio, so I don't want to get into, like, all my, like, Skynet, like, Terminator 2 Matrix philosophies, but like, I do think a lot, having worked for streaming services, you know, I think a lot about, you know, the people I saw writing our code and how they were interpreting even the customer journey through a user interface of how we're getting this information, not to mention the data that we're voluntarily giving up and that's being aggregated to use back against us in this cycle. You know, how...
You know, there are some things that you can do to break out, like, you know, there are servers, you know, search engines like DuckDuckGo that will not collect your information. I mean, I saw a presentation about how much information is collected from us by Google and Facebook and all of big tech. And essentially we are their worker slaves. We are handing it away for free. And actually this presentation, the person had this radical idea of what if we actually owned our own data and had it to sell or not as we choose. That would completely redefine things, right?
I'm, yes, very much of the camp that I should be paid for the content that I post.
Exactly.
And the data, yes.
Because they are mining all of that data and selling all of that data, and we are just their free worker bees, and we're giving it away. We think we're getting it for free. We think Facebook is free. You're not getting anything for free. There's a huge cost. And so it's really the only thing that you can argue for people, you know, is awareness. You know, like try to educate yourself. Try to, you know, keep yourself aware.
Absolutely. Lee, do you touch on AI in your ethics classes?
I don't. I teach a very traditional theoretical ethics class. I taught a bioethics class one time where, you know, the stakes are literally life and death because we talk about abortion, euthanasia, human research, animal rights, you know, those sorts of things. So I do very much get into the practical, you know, everyday questions. We haven't, there is a question now. It tends, I guess it's an ethical question, but it also comes up in philosophy of mind of, do robots have rights?
Yes,
you know,
I have feelings about that.
As they're closer simulations to human beings, then the question is, what's the actual distinction, and where, this is a question in ethics, where does morality come from? What do we owe other beings, and does it matter how they were made? It's not a silly question even about things like, you think about for clones, which is the real one, which is the clone? Do they have different rights because one's a clone, one's not? Don't get me started on all this, because philosophers, I'll have, you know, I'll take this 100 different ways now.
Well, it's
only a little bit to talk about it.
I think it's going to come up as we start to see that jobs are being replaced by robots. Then, like, are humans, you know, how are robots entitled to unemployment when factories are being shut down? You know, well, there are so many questions that we're gonna ask. I do see that there is a question in the Q&A, and I know we're a little bit over time, but I think I just want to make sure that we address it. But Christina Wren asked the question, what type of character or character journey can inspire current audiences to seek out actual truth and believe in the concept of truth? I certainly would throw out that both of these two books, both Convince Me and Post-Truth, are excellent examples of encouraging people to go on a journey and seek out truth. But I will also let, I know Nina and Lee have a lot of resources, so I will let them answer the question as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Christina. And I think that you could either go really directly into it by having someone who is on a search for a particular truth, kind of like I did in my book, where the search is, what is the truth of this man who we thought was one thing and another. And I think that so I think that that's a very head-on way to address it. But I also think that, you know, any dramatic situation where you're dealing with these concepts, where you start with, I want to examine the truth, I want to encourage people towards the truth, then you begin to think about what characters could encourage people into that discussion. And you can, again, reverse engineer, right? You can decide these would be the best characters in this situation. So I would say, decide on your theme, decide on what kind of truth you want to tell, and then just be careful that your characters are empathetic and people, so that readers will relate to them on a human level, even if they're not there yet with their intellectual discovery about the truth. That's how you bring them along, is you connect on the gut level, and then they'll follow along on the intellectual journey.
So do you know that the phrase, the villain is the hero of his own narrative. That's very important for fiction. And the best thing that I ever read on that was a nonfiction book by one of my favorite authors named Robert Trivers, who's an evolutionary psychologist, really a very prominent evolutionary psychologist. And his book is called The Folly of Fools. And it's about self-delusion. It's about this, through a perspective of an evolutionist, how it is that we evolve to lie to ourselves. Because remember, we're not just lying to other people, we're lying to ourselves. And his answer is, we learn to lie to ourselves because it makes us better liars. If we actually believe the lies that we're saying, we're more convincing to other people. That is
fine in my book. That's
absolutely, well, I don't know if you've ever read Trivers, but I mean, that is The Folly of Fools, Robert Trivers, one of the best books I've ever read. So insightful. Just, I mean, that's just one of the many insights in that book. For fiction, a book that I read recently that just knocked my socks off was Margaret Atwood, The Testaments. Just as good as The Handmaid's Tale, the whole way through. You know, they say either read with passion or with a pencil. I kind of had both, because the whole way through, she was talking about truth without, I think, ever naming it. The whole, all the line, the subterfuge, the different nuances of how she was doing it. I mean, it was a master class, kind of a latter-day Orwell of, you know, how to write that kind of book. I thought that was wonderful.
I'm glad you recommended that, because I got to meet her last year. She's one of my literary cons, and it was one of the most exciting. She was every bit as wonderful and feisty and tart-tongued as you would hope. And I just thought she was amazing. So I'm glad you brought her up. Yeah. She's a futurist in many ways, and yet a truth teller at the same time.
When is she going to win the Nobel Prize? I wish they would just do it already.
She is part of the Future Library, which is one of the most optimistic things I've ever heard about. And the Future Library is a conceit of an Oslo-based artist. And that artist is a woman, asked 100 authors to contribute an unseen manuscript. It could be anything, one page to a whole novel that no one had ever seen for 100 years. And at the same time, one a year, Margaret is among them. They're also growing a forest so that when the 100 years is up, they will have trees to print them all. And they're preserving a printing press. And when I heard about this, I thought it was one of the greatest things ever, because it was so optimistic. We're going to have a culture where we still care about books and reading and authors, and
I love that.
And you know, and we'll have the trees to do it. It's you can look it up online.
Yeah, thanks for telling me that.
Yeah. That is so cool. That's so amazing. Well, this has been wonderful. You're both geniuses. This is fantastic. Thank you for sharing your gifts, not only with your work, but for sharing your insights and your points of view with us, for encouraging us to seek out the truth, to take responsibility, to be responsible for our own ethics, for ourselves and for our communities and our families. And thank you for sharing your gifts and talents and wisdom with us today.
Yeah. Thank you again, Rebecca, for moderating, and to Lee for joining, and to my awesome team at NYU LA, without whom nothing happens. So
yes, thank you so much to Nina for creating these discovery sessions and for creating making NYU in LA a thing, especially for keeping it going online during these trying times.
That's been crazy, but that's a whole other panel. Like, you know, flexibility under pressure. That's a whole other day. But
I want to say thank you to both of you as well. I'm a long way from writing those little technical articles now. I get to do fun stuff like this. Thank you for including me.
You're very welcome. And I just want to urge everyone, if you want to go check out my website, sign up for my monthly dispatch, which is filled with tidbits of entertainment and education. And I don't know, do you have a website that you want to encourage people to visit?
I do. It's called LeeMcIntyreBooks.com, and it's got links to all of my books and a little Q&A about the neighborhood I grew up in and how that changed me, and it's got events and news and all sorts of things.
All right. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for your appreciative comments in the chat. Really appreciate that, everybody. Thanks,
everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.